George Strait and his son Bubba hear a street cleaner singing. What they decide to do moves all of Texas. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of San Antonio, Texas, as Joe Martinez began his daily routine. At 45, his weathered hands gripped the worn handle of his push broom with the familiarity of a musician holding a cherished instrument. Sweat already beaded on his forehead despite the early hour, the relentless Texas heat giving no quarter even in April. "Another beautiful day the good Lord has blessed us with," Joe murmured to himself, a habit formed during countless solitary hours on these streets. He adjusted his bright orange municipal uniform, faded from years of washing and sun exposure, and continued his methodical sweeping. The streets were relatively quiet this morning. A few early commuters hurried past, eyes fixed on smartphones, barely acknowledging the man who kept their sidewalks clean. Joe had grown accustomed to being invisible. After 12 years as a street cleaner, he understood his place in the social hierarchy of the city, essential yet overlooked, necessary yet forgotten. But Joe possessed something that the hurried passers-by couldn't see, a voice that could make angels pause mid-flight and listen. A voice that carried the weight of hardship, the warmth of hope, and the pure, undiluted passion of a dream deferred but never abandoned. As he worked his way down Houston Street, approaching the Riverwalk area, Joe began to hum softly. The melody, tentative at first, soon blossomed into the opening lines of "Amarillo by Morning," one of George Strait's timeless classics. His rich baritone floated through the morning air, wrapping around streetlights and dancing between buildings. "Amarillo by morning, up from San Antone." The words flowed from somewhere deep inside him, a place where dreams still lived, despite life's repeated attempts to extinguish them. His voice swelled with each phrase, resonating with an authenticity that couldn't be taught or manufactured. For these precious moments, Joe wasn't a 45-year-old janitor pushing a broom. He was simply a man expressing his soul through music, channeling his lifelong passion in the only venue available to him, the empty streets of early morning San Antonio. Joe had been singing for as long as he could remember. Growing up in a small house on the outskirts of Corpus Christi, music had been his escape, his comfort and his joy. His father, a construction worker with calloused hands and a tender heart, had introduced him to country music through an old radio that sat on their kitchen counter. Together, they'd listen to George Strait, Merle Haggard, and Johnny Cash, while his mother prepared dinner after long shifts at the local diner. "You got something special in that voice, mijo," his father would tell him, eyes crinkling at the corners. "Someday, the whole world's gonna hear it." That someday never came. Life had other plans for Joe Martinez. His father's unexpected death, when Joe was 17, forced him to abandon his education and find work to help support his mother and 3 younger siblings. The years that followed were a blur of minimum wage jobs, missed opportunities, and gradually shrinking dreams. By 25, he had married his high school sweetheart, Maria, whose faith in his talent never wavered despite the mounting evidence that success might remain forever out of reach. By 30, they had 2 children, Consuela and Miguel, and the responsibilities of parenthood pushed music further into the background. When the economic downturn hit and construction jobs dried up, Joe took the city maintenance position out of desperation. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable, with benefits for his family. Now, 15 years later, Joe found himself halfway through life, working a job that drained his body but provided little fulfillment for his soul. Music remained his private salvation, a secret garden he tended in stolen moments, singing while working his roots, humming lullabies to his now teenage children, occasionally strumming the second-hand guitar he kept hidden in the garage. As Joe rounded the corner onto Commerce Street, His voice gained confidence, unaware of any potential audience in the quiet morning. "Everything that I got is just what I've got on," he sang, feeling the familiar ache in his chest whenever he performed this particular song. Something about its lyrics of traveling, loss, and persistent hope resonated deeply with him, reflecting his own journey of deferred dreams. He was so immersed in the music that he didn't notice the two men who had stopped at the intersection. Ahead, their attention captured by his voice, carrying through the morning air. "When that sun is high in that Texas sky, I'll be bucking at the county fair." The younger of the two men nudged the older one, whose eyes had widened in surprise. They stood perfectly still, listening as Joe continued sweeping and singing, lost in his own world. "Amarillo by morning, Amarillo, I'll be there." Joe finished the chorus with a slight vocal flourish that would have made any professional vocalist proud. He sighed softly, finding comfort in the familiar melody as he had countless times before. These private concerts were sometimes the only thing that kept his spirit alive during long, physically demanding days. "Hey there," a voice called out, startling Joe from his musical reverie. Joe looked up, immediately recognizing the two figures approaching him. His heart nearly stopped. The older man, tall and lean with that unmistakable cowboy hat and distinguished features, weathered by time yet still handsome, could only be George Strait himself, the very artist whose song he'd just been singing. Beside him walked a younger man who Joe recognized as Bubba Strait, George's son. Joe froze, mortified. Had they heard him? Of course they had. Why else would George Strait be approaching a city janitor on an empty street at 7:30 in the morning? He felt heat rush to his face that had nothing to do with the Texas sun. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb anyone," Joe stammered, gripping his broom handle tightly. "I just get carried away sometimes." George Strait's face broke into a warm smile. "Disturb? Son, that was the finest rendition of my song I've heard in a long while." Joe blinked in disbelief. Was George Strait, the king of country, the living legend with 60 #1 hits, complimenting him, a street cleaner? "Thank you, sir," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "That means a lot coming from you. I'm a huge fan." "I'd like to think you are, considering how well you sing my songs," George replied with a gentle chuckle. "What's your name?" "Joe." "Joe Martinez, sir." "Well, Joe Martinez, you've got yourself quite a voice there. Don't you think so, Bubba?" George turned to his son, who nodded enthusiastically. "Incredible tone and control," Bubba agreed. "You've obviously been singing a long time." Joe nodded, still struggling to process this surreal encounter. "All my life, really, just never professionally or anything." "And why's that?" George asked, his eyes curious but kind. "A voice like yours belongs on a stage." The question, though asked without judgment, pierced Joe like a knife. Why indeed? The short answer was life. Life with its responsibilities, its financial pressures, its cruelly timed tragedies and obligations. But standing before his musical hero, Joe couldn't bring himself to recite the litany of excuses and circumstances, however legitimate they might be. "Just never got the chance, I guess," he said finally, eyes dropping to the pavement he'd been sweeping. "Had to take care of family. This job. It's not glamorous, but it's steady. Right here in the middle." Of that conversation, I want to ask all of you watching this to consider subscribing to our channel. We share stories like this one that touch the heart and remind us of our common humanity. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from and what you think of Joe and his incredible talent so far. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue bringing these powerful stories straight to you. Now let's get back to this amazing encounter between our janitor and the king of country music. George nodded thoughtfully, seeming to weigh Joe's words. There was no pity in his expression, only a deep understanding that made Joe stand a little straighter, feeling seen in a way he rarely experienced. Mind if we walk with you a bit? George asked, gesturing down the street. Joe glanced at his supervisor's truck parked several blocks away. He was already behind schedule, but how could he refuse? I'd be honored, Mr. Strait. Just George, please, the country star insisted. As they walked, Joe pushing his broom in between stretches of conversation, George asked him about his life. Simple questions that somehow opened floodgates Joe hadn't known existed. He found himself telling this famous stranger about growing up in Corpus Christi, about his father's early death, about the talent shows he'd won in high school before reality forced his dreams to take a back seat. Had a chance once, Joe admitted, as they neared the end of his route. Local radio station contest when I was 22. Won first place. Prize was a trip to Nashville, meeting with some producers. What happened? Bubba asked. Joe shrugged, the memory still carrying its sting after all these years. Week before I was supposed to go, my mother had a stroke. Needed care, therapy, used the contest money for her medical bills instead. He paused, then added, no regrets. Though she raised us by herself after Dad died, couldn't turn my back on her. George stopped walking, causing Joe to pause too. The country star studied him with newfound respect. Family first. Always admired that in a man. Yes, sir, Joe nodded. Besides, Nashville's full of great singers. Probably wouldn't have made it anyway. I wouldn't be so sure about that, George said. You've got something rare, Joe. It's not just technique. Plenty of singers have that. You've got soul, authenticity. You sing like you've lived every word. Joe felt something shift inside him at the validation, a small flame rekindling where only embers had remained for years. Before he could respond, his radio crackled to life. Martinez, where are you on that route? You should have been at Riverside 20 minutes ago. His supervisor's impatient voice cut through the moment. Joe quickly grabbed the radio from his belt. Sorry, sir. Got delayed. Heading there now. He looked apologetically at George and Bubba. Duty calls. I can't thank you enough for stopping. This, he gestured between them, this will be a story I tell my grandkids someday, meeting George Strait while sweeping the streets. As he prepared to leave, George placed a hand on his shoulder. Hold up. Where can we hear you sing? You perform anywhere? Open mics? Church? Joe shook his head. Not really. Sometimes at familiar gatherings, that's about it. George exchanged a meaningful look with his son, then reached into his pocket and handed Joe a business card. There's a charity event tomorrow night at the Flores Ballroom. Small affair, raising money for veterans. Why don't you come by around 7? Might be nice to have some local talent. Joe stared at the card in disbelief. You want me to perform? At your event? Just one song, George said with a casual shrug that belied the enormity of what he was offering. See how it feels, being on a real stage for once. Joe's hand trembled slightly as he took the card. I don't know what to say. Say you'll be there, Bubba encouraged. Dad's right about your voice. People should hear it. Yes, I'll be there, Joe finally managed, his heart racing with fear and excitement in equal measure. Good man, George smiled, tipping his hat slightly. We'll see you tomorrow night. As the two men walked away, Joe stood rooted. To the spot, the business card clutched in his hand like a golden ticket. Had that really happened? Had George Strait himself just invited him to sing at an event? Only when his radio crackled again, with his supervisor's increasingly irritated voice, did Joe snap back to reality. As he hurried toward his next location, his mind whirled with possibilities and fears. What would he wear? What song should he sing? What would Maria and the kids say? Could this be the chance he'd stopped believing would ever come? For the first time in years, Joe Martinez felt something dangerous and wonderful taking root in his heart. Hope. Joe rushed home after his shift ended, his mind still reeling from the morning's encounter. He lived in a modest neighborhood on the south side of San Antonio, in a small but well-maintained house that represented 15 years of mortgage payments and countless overtime shifts. The yard was neat, with Maria's prized roses lining the walkway, a splash of color against the beige exterior. "Maria!" he called out as he burst through the front door, forgetting that his wife would still be at her job as a receptionist at the local clinic. The house was quiet, save for the distant sound of the television coming from his son Miguel's room. At 17, Miguel was going through a phase of mild rebellion, spending too much time playing video games and not enough on his studies, something that caused frequent tension between father and son. Joe went to the bathroom and stared at his reflection in the mirror. Gray peppered his black hair at the temples, and fine lines had formed around his eyes, evidence of years spent squinting in the Texas sun. His uniform was stained with sweat and street grime. How could someone like him possibly belong on a stage where George Strait performed? Yet the country legend's words echoed in his mind. "You've got something rare, Joe." After a quick shower, Joe went to the garage, his sanctuary. In the corner, behind old paint cans and boxes of Christmas decorations, he kept his guitar case. He hadn't opened it in months, maybe longer. Life had a way of pushing music aside, reducing it to a luxury he couldn't afford to indulge in regularly. The case creaked as he opened it, revealing the guitar his father had given him for his 16th birthday. It wasn't expensive or fancy, just a second-hand Yamaha acoustic with a small scratch on its body, but it represented one of the few connections he still had to his father. Joe sat on an overturned milk crate and began to tune the instrument, fingers remembering their positions despite the time away. Once satisfied with the sound, he began to strum the opening chords to Amarillo by Morning. His fingers were stiff at first, missing notes and fumbling transitions he once executed flawlessly. But gradually, muscle memory returned, and the song took shape beneath his hands. He began to sing, softly at first, then with growing confidence. As he recalled George Strait's compliments, the music filled the small garage, transforming the cluttered space into something almost sacred. Joe was so engrossed that he didn't notice Miguel standing in the doorway until he finished the song. "Damn, Dad," Miguel said, genuine surprise in his voice. "I didn't know you could still play like that." Joe looked up, startled. "Still got a little music left in these old fingers," he said with a small smile. "How long you been standing there?" "Long enough," Miguel replied, leaning against the doorframe. "What's the occasion? Thought you'd given up on all that." There was something in his son's tone, not quite mockery, but a hint of skepticism that stung. Had he really allowed his children to believe he'd abandoned his passion entirely? "You wouldn't believe what happened today," Joe said, setting the guitar aside. "I was working my route downtown, singing to myself like I sometimes do, and who do you think stopped to listen?" Miguel shrugged, already looking bored. "I don't know. The mayor or something." "George Strait." His son's expression shifted from indifference to disbelief. "Yeah, right, and I'm Selena Gomez." "It's true," Joe insisted, pulling the business card from his pocket. "Him and his son Bubba, they heard me singing and stopped to talk, and he invited me to perform at some charity event tomorrow night." Miguel took the card, examining it with wide eyes. "Holy shit," he muttered. "This is for real?" "Language," Joe corrected automatically, though his heart wasn't in it. "Yes, it's real. I'm supposed to sing one song." "That's actually pretty cool, Dad." Miguel handed the card back, regarding his father with new eyes. "You gonna do it?" "I think I am." As Joe said the words aloud, determination solidified within him. "I have to, right? Chances like this don't come twice." Miguel nodded slowly. "Mom's gonna flip out." "In a good way, I hope," Joe said, though uncertainty gnawed at him. Maria had always supported his music, but over the years she'd become the practical one, the voice of reason that kept their family grounded in reality rather than dreams. Maria's reaction when she arrived home an hour later was more complex than either Joe or Miguel had anticipated. She listened to the story twice, examined the business card, and sat silently at their kitchen table for several long moments. "You're sure it was really him?" she finally asked. "George Strait himself?" "Positive," Joe confirmed. "I've seen enough pictures and videos to know. Plus, his son was with him. Bubba. It was them, Maria. I swear on my mother's grave." Maria twisted her wedding band nervously. At 43, she remained beautiful to Joe, though worry had etched permanent lines between her brows. "And he wants you to sing at this event tomorrow? Just like that?" "Just one song. He said it's a small charity thing for veterans." "What? If it's some kind of joke," Maria said, voicing the fear that had been lurking in the back of Joe's mind. "Rich people can be cruel sometimes, Joe. They might be setting you up to laugh at you." The suggestion hurt, but Joe couldn't entirely dismiss it. "George Strait isn't like that. Everyone knows he's one of the good ones. Besides, what would be the point? I'm just saying, it seems too good to be true." Maria reached across the table and took his hand. "I don't want to see you hurt, mi amor. Not again." Her words transported Joe back 20 years to the devastation he'd felt after. Another chance at music had slipped through his fingers. He'd won that radio contest fair and square, had been preparing for Nashville when his mother's stroke changed everything. Maria had held him through nights of silent tears, understanding both his sacrifice and his loss. "I have to try," he said softly. "Even if nothing comes of it beyond tomorrow night, I have to know." Maria's eyes softened. "Then we'll make sure you're ready. What are you going to wear? Your good suit needs pressing. And which song will you perform?" The question hung in the air. Joe hadn't considered it fully until now. "Maybe Amarillo by Morning," Miguel suggested from the doorway where he'd been listening. "That's what he heard you singing, right?" Joe shook his head. "No, that would be too obvious. I need something that shows range, something meaningful." They discussed options over dinner, with even their 15-year-old daughter Consuela joining. In once, she returned from band practice. The family hadn't gathered so animatedly around the table in months, perhaps years. Music, which had once been the center of their household, had somehow slipped to the periphery amid the daily grind of work, school, and bills. By evening's end, Joe had settled on The Chair, another George Strait classic, but one with more emotional depth and vocal challenges. He spent hours in the garage practicing until his fingers were sore and his voice began to show signs of strain. "Enough, Joe," Maria finally called from the door. "You'll have no voice left tomorrow if you keep this up." Reluctantly, he put the guitar away and followed her to bed, though sleep proved elusive. His mind kept replaying the morning's encounter, imagining tomorrow night, picturing himself on stage after so many years of believing that dream was dead. "What if I freeze? Up there?" he whispered into the darkness. Maria's hand found his beneath the covers. "You won't. Music has always been in your blood, Joe. It's who you are, even when you push it aside." Her words comforted him, though anxiety still coiled in his stomach. He eventually drifted into restless sleep, dreaming of spotlights and microphones and George Strait's approving nod. The following day crawled by with excruciating slowness. Joe had requested the day off from work, a rare occurrence that his supervisor had grudgingly approved after hearing about the family emergency. It wasn't entirely a lie. This opportunity felt like an emergency of sorts, a critical juncture that demanded his full attention. He spent the morning running errands, getting a haircut, picking up his freshly pressed suit from the cleaners, even splurging on a new pair of boots he couldn't really afford. But that made him feel more the part of a performer than his worn work shoes would. By late afternoon, as he prepared to leave for the Flores ballroom, Joe felt a familiar presence at his side. His father had been dead for nearly 30 years, yet in moments like these, Joe could almost sense him standing there, offering silent encouragement. "Wish you could see this, Papa," he murmured as he adjusted his bolo tie in the mirror. "Might finally be using that voice you believed in. He'd be proud," Maria said from the bedroom doorway, startling him. She looked lovely in a simple blue dress she'd worn to their niece's quinceañera last year. "We all are." Miguel and Consuela appeared beside their mother, both dressed in their Sunday best. Seeing his family prepared to support him brought a lump to Joe's throat. "You're all coming?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. "Wild horses couldn't keep us away," Maria said, using one of his father's old expressions. "Besides, how often do we get to see your name in lights?" Joe laughed, though his heart hammered with nervousness. "Hardly in lights, Maria. It's just one song at a small event." "But it's a start," she replied, her faith in him shining in her eyes. "Who knows where it might lead?" The Flores Ballroom was located in a renovated historic building downtown, elegant but not ostentatious. As they approached the entrance, Joe's steps slowed. A doubt crashed over him like a wave, nearly stopping him in his tracks. "I don't belong here," he whispered to Maria. "These people, they're not my world." Maria squeezed his arm. "Music is your world, Joe. Always has been. These people just live in it." Drawing strength from her confidence, Joe approached the door, where a young man in a suit checked names against a guest list. "Joe Martinez," he said, his mouth dry. "I'm supposed to perform tonight." The young man scanned his list, then looked up with a smile. "Yes, Mr. Martinez, Mr. Strait mentioned you'd be coming. Please, follow me." Joe glanced back at his family, suddenly terrified of leaving their side. "We'll be right there watching," Maria assured him. "Go, this is your moment." The backstage area was modest but bustling with activity. Sound engineers adjusted equipment while volunteers arranged silent auction items on tables. No one paid much attention to Joe as he was led to a small green room. "Wait here, please," the young man instructed. "Someone will come get you when it's time." Alone in the small room, Joe paced nervously. His guitar, which he'd brought in its case, stood propped against a wall. He picked it up, strumming quietly to calm his nerves, running through the chair one last time. A knock at the door interrupted his practice. Joe looked up, expecting a stage manager or event coordinator. Instead, George Strait himself stood in the doorway, looking every bit the country legend in a crisp western shirt, dark jeans, and his signature cowboy hat. "Thought I'd check in, see how you're holding up," George said, stepping into the room. Joe stood quickly, almost knocking over his chair. "Mr. Strait, I mean George, I'm good, just a little nervous. It's been a long time since I performed." "For anyone outside my family," George nodded understandingly. "First song's always the hardest. After that, it's like riding a bicycle." He gestured to the guitar. "That's a nice instrument. Got some history to it." "My father's," Joe explained, running his hand along the worn wood. "He gave it to me before he passed. Taught me my first chords on it." "Those are the best kind," George said, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. "Holds the music of generations." He paused, studying Joe. "You decided what you're singing tonight?" "The Chair," Joe answered. "Hope that's okay. It's always been special to me." "Good choice. Tricky bridge, though," George commented. "You got it down?" "I think so," Joe said, then hesitated. Would you mind listening to a bit of it? Just to make sure I'm not making a fool of myself out there." George smiled warmly. "I'd be honored." Heart pounding, Joe positioned his fingers on the fretboard and began to play. The opening notes of The Chair filled the small room, and after a brief introduction, he began to sing. Joe's voice filled the small green room, rich and textured with emotion. "Well, excuse me, but I think you've got my chair," he sang. His eyes closed as he lost himself in the familiar melody. The song told the story of a chance meeting between strangers that blossoms into something more, a narrative of unexpected connection that felt particularly fitting given the circumstances. As he navigated the bridge, hitting the higher notes, with surprising ease, Joe allowed himself to fully inhabit the music. Years of singing purely for the love of it had stripped away any artifice from his performance, leaving only raw authenticity. When he finished the final chorus, letting the last note fade naturally, the room fell silent. Joe opened his eyes to find George Strait watching him with an expression that could only be described as stunned. "Well," George said after a moment, clearing his throat, "I think we've found our opener for tonight." "Opener?" Joe repeated, confused. "I thought I was just doing one song somewhere in the middle." George shook his head. "Change of plans. You're opening the show." That performance was too good to bury in the program. Panic flashed through Joe. "But I can't. There'll be more people at the beginning. More attention." "Exactly," George said with a knowing smile. "More people to hear what I heard yesterday." "Morning. That voice deserves an audience, Joe." Before Joe could protest further, the door opened again, and Bubba Strait entered, accompanied by a man in his 50s wearing an expensive suit and an air of authority. "Dad, Richard's looking for you. We need to finalize the—" Bubba stopped mid-sentence when he saw Joe. "Hey, the singing janitor, glad you made it." Though the nickname was delivered without malice, Joe felt his cheeks warm with embarrassment. He was suddenly acutely aware of the gulf between himself and these men, not just in terms of wealth or fame, but in belonging. He was an intruder in their world, a momentary curiosity. "Richard, this is Joe Martinez," George said, gesturing toward him. "He's going to open for us tonight." "Joe, this is Richard Callahan, director of the Texas Veterans Foundation and our host this evening." The suited man turned to Joe with mild surprise, extending a manicured hand. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Martinez. I wasn't aware we'd added another performer to the lineup." "Last-minute decision," George explained smoothly. "Wait till you hear him sing. Reminds me of myself 30 years ago, but with better range." Richard's expression remained polite but skeptical. "I see. Well, we're running a tight schedule tonight. Lots of donors in attendance who expect to hear from you, George." He checked his watch. "We're opening doors in 20 minutes. I need you both for the pre-event reception with the platinum sponsors." "Of course," George agreed. He turned to Joe. "You'll be on in about an hour. Bubba will make sure you get to the stage on time." As the two older men left, Bubba lingered, studying Joe with curious eyes. "Dad doesn't usually take to strangers like this," he remarked. "You must have really impressed him with that voice of yours." Joe shrugged uncomfortably. "Guess I just got lucky. Right place, right time." "Maybe," Bubba conceded. "Or maybe talent finally met opportunity. Happens less often than you'd think in this business." He glanced at the door. "I should go join them. There's water and soda in that mini-fridge if you need it. I'll come get you when it's time." Alone again, Joe sat heavily on a folding chair, guitar across his lap. Opener. The word echoed in his mind, simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. He'd gone from expecting to perform one song for a half-attentive audience to opening the entire show. His cell phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from Maria. "Where are you? We're seated now. So many fancy people here." Joe typed back with trembling fingers. "Backstage. They changed plans. I'm opening the show." 3 dots appeared immediately, followed by, "Dios mío! You'll be amazing! We're all so proud!" Her confidence bolstered him, but only slightly. Joe set his phone aside and tried to focus on his breathing, on the familiar weight of the guitar in his hands, on anything but the growing knot of anxiety in his stomach. Time seemed to both crawl and race. When Bubba finally returned to escort him to the wings of the stage, Joe felt as though he'd aged 10 years in the waiting. "Nervous?" Bubba asked as they navigated the backstage corridor. "Terrified," Joe admitted honestly. Bubba chuckled. "Good. Means you care. Use it. Channel it into the performance." They reached the side of the stage, where Joe could now see the ballroom properly for the first time. Round tables filled with well-dressed attendees stretched before a modest stage. Elegant. Centerpieces and soft lighting, creating an intimate atmosphere despite the room's size. Somewhere in that sea of faces were Maria and his children, though he couldn't spot them from his position. A woman with a headset approached them. 5 minutes, she informed Bubba, then gave Joe a curious once-over. "Is this our surprise opener?" Bubba nodded. "This is Joe Martinez. Joe, this is Shannon, our stage manager tonight. Do you need anything special for your setup?" Shannon asked, all business. "Backup tracks, special lighting. Just me and my guitar," Joe replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Shannon nodded approvingly. "Acoustic opener. Nice touch. Keeps it authentic." She made a note on her clipboard. "You'll be introduced by Richard Callahan. When he says your name, that's your cue. Center stage. Spotlight will find you." She gave him a quick, professional smile. "Good luck." On stage, Richard Callahan stepped to the microphone, tapping it. Twice to gather the audience's attention, the low murmur of conversation gradually subsided. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 7th Annual Texas Veterans Foundation Benefit Concert," Richard began, his voice practiced and smooth. "We're delighted to have you all here tonight as we raise funds for our returning heroes." Joe listened, with half an ear as Richard delivered his opening remarks, thanking sponsors and explaining the foundation's work. His heart pounded so loudly he was certain everyone backstage could hear it. "Before we welcome our main attraction, the legendary George Strait," Richard continued, "we have a special treat for you, a local talent discovered by George himself, performing publicly for the first time in many years. Please welcome to the stage, Joe Martinez." The applause was polite but reserved, the reaction of an audience expecting little from an unknown opener. Bubba gave Joe a gentle push toward the stage. "Knock 'em dead," he whispered. Joe's legs carried him forward mechanically. The spotlight found him as Shannon had promised, its brightness momentarily blinding after the dimness of the wings. He reached the microphone stand at center stage, adjusting it with hands that refused to stop trembling. "Good evening," he said, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Good evening, I'm Joe Martinez. I want to thank George Strait for this opportunity. I'm going to sing the chair for you tonight." Someone in the audience coughed. Another whispered audibly to their companion. Joe felt sweat beading on his forehead as he positioned his guitar and strummed the opening chord. The first notes came out tentative and slightly off rhythm, his nervous fingers betraying him. Joe faltered, nearly stopping altogether as panic threatened to overwhelm him. Then, in the third row, he spotted them, Maria, Miguel, and Consuela, watching him with such naked hope and pride that it nearly broke his heart. "For them," he thought, "for the sacrifices we've all made, for Papa who believed in this voice." Joe took a deep breath, reset his fingers on the fretboard, and began again. This time the introduction flowed naturally, his muscle memory taking over despite the nerves. And when he began to sing, something remarkable happened. The room disappeared, the spotlight, the audience, the pressure, all of it faded away until there was only the music, only the story he was telling through song. His voice, initially soft, gained power and confidence with each phrase, filling the ballroom with a warmth and authenticity that couldn't be taught. By the time he reached the chorus, Joe was no longer a janitor nervously performing on borrowed time. He was simply a man sharing his gift, his passion, his soul through music. He hit the challenging notes of the bridge flawlessly, the years of singing in private having honed his natural talent to a fine edge. As the final notes of the song faded, Joe slowly returned to himself, to the awareness of where he was and what he had just done. For a terrifying moment, silence reigned. Then the applause began, tentative at first, then building to a roar that took him completely by surprise. People were standing, their faces showing genuine appreciation and, in some cases, astonishment. In his peripheral vision, Joe saw George Strait at the side of the stage, nodding with satisfaction. But his eyes sought out his family. Maria was weeping openly, her hands clasped as if in prayer. Miguel and Consuela were on their feet, shouting and whistling with unrestrained enthusiasm. Richard Callahan returned to the stage, looking pleasantly surprised as he took the microphone. "Well, what a way to start the evening. Joe Martinez, ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it again for this remarkable discovery." The renewed applause washed over Joe as he bowed awkwardly and made his way off stage, his legs now shaky for entirely different reasons. "That was incredible," Shannon said as he reached the wings, surprise evident in her voice. "Are you sure you haven't been performing professionally all this time?" Joe shook his head, unable to form words. The adrenaline that had carried him through the performance was beginning to ebb, leaving him lightheaded and disoriented. "Come on," Bubba said, taking his arm. "Let's get you some water and a place to sit down." They had barely made it back to the green room when George Strait entered, his expression thoughtful. "That performance," George said without preamble, "was exactly what I knew it would be. Authentic, soulful, real." "Thank you," Joe managed, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I still can't believe that happened." "Believe it," George replied. "And believe this, you've got a gift that shouldn't be swept under the rug anymore, or swept off the streets in your case." His eyes twinkled with gentle humor. Something in his tone made Joe pause. "What are you saying?" George settled into a chair across from him. "I'm saying that I'd like to help you find some opportunities to perform. Nothing big to start. Some local venues, events where people who matter might hear you." Joe stared at him in disbelief. "Why would you do that for me? You don't even know me." "I know your voice," George said simply, "and I know what it's like to have music inside you that needs to come out. Not everyone gets the chances I got. Sometimes talent needs a little push from someone who's already inside the door." Bubba leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Dad's got good instincts about these things. If he thinks you've got what it takes, you probably do." "But my job—" "My family," Joe began. "No one's talking about quitting your day job or running off to Nashville," George assured him. "Just some local gigs to start, see where it leads. Maybe some weekend spots at dance halls, that sort of thing. Build up an audience, get comfortable performing again." Joe felt dizzy with possibility. After decades of believing his dream was permanently deferred, here was George Strait himself, offering a path forward. It wasn't a guarantee of success, but it was a chance, a real chance to share his music with the world. "I don't know how to thank you," he said finally. "Just don't waste the opportunity," George replied. "That's thanks enough." A knock at the door interrupted them. Shannon poked her head in. "Sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Martinez has some very insistent family members asking for him in the lobby." Joe stood, suddenly eager to see Maria and the kids, to share this unbelievable development with them. "I should go to them." "Of course," George nodded. "We'll talk more later. I'm on in 10 minutes anyway." As Joe gathered his guitar and prepared to leave, George added, "Oh, and Joe, hold on to that janitorial job for now. Some of the best songs come from real-life experiences. Your story, your struggles. That's what makes your voice special. Don't lose touch with that." Bubba escorted Joe through the backstage area and into the lobby where Maria, Miguel, and Consuela waited anxiously. When they saw him, they rushed forward, enveloping him in a group embrace. "Papa, you were amazing!" Consuela exclaimed, her eyes shining with tears. "Everyone was talking about you." Even the fancy people at our table were impressed, Miguel added, his usual teenage coolness momentarily forgotten. This one lady kept asking if you had an album or something. Maria simply held his face between her hands, her eyes saying everything words couldn't. After a moment she managed, "I always knew, Joe, always." As his family's excitement washed over him, Joe felt a strange sense of completion, as if a circle begun long ago was finally closing. The years of sacrifice, of putting dreams aside, for practicality, hadn't been the end of his story after all, merely a detour on a longer journey. "George Strait wants to help me find places to perform," he told them, still hardly believing it himself. "Local venues, weekend spots, nothing big, but a beginning," Maria finished for him, understanding immediately. A real beginning. Over their shoulders, Joe noticed a distinguished-looking man watching their family celebration with interest. He was impeccably dressed in what was clearly an expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. Something about his expression, calculating, assessing, made Joe uneasy. The man caught Joe's eye and nodded slightly before turning, away to join a group of equally well-dressed patrons heading back into the ballroom. "Who was that?" Joe asked Bubba quietly. Bubba glanced over. "Victor Reynolds, big-time music producer from Austin, works with some major Texas artists." He raised an eyebrow. "Looks like you caught his attention." Joe felt a flutter of excitement, quickly tempered by caution. One performance, one moment in the spotlight, didn't erase a lifetime of disappointments and practical concerns. But for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to imagine a different path forward, one where his voice, his music, might reach beyond the streets of San Antonio to touch other hearts. "Let's go back in," he said to his family. "I want to hear George perform. After all," he added with a small smile, "I should study the competition." Their laughter, bright and hopeful, carried them back into the ballroom, where the King of Country was about to take the stage, and where Joe Martinez, janitor, father, and newly rediscovered singer, had just taken the first step toward reclaiming a dream he'd thought was forever lost. 3 weeks after the charity event, Joe found himself in an unfamiliar position, on stage at the Broken Spoke, one of San Antonio's most beloved honky-tonk venues. The crowd was modest but enthusiastic, a mix of regular patrons and a few curious newcomers who had heard about the janitor with the golden voice through local buzz. Word had spread quickly after his performance at the Veterans Benefit. Someone had filmed his rendition of The Chair on their phone, and the video had circulated among local country music enthusiasts. The fact that George Strait himself had discovered and endorsed, Joe added a compelling narrative that people couldn't resist. "Thank you," Joe said into the microphone as he finished his third song of the evening, a cover of Merle Haggard's Mama Tried that had the audience clapping along. "I'm still getting used to being on this side of the room." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Joe was discovering that his natural humility played well with audiences. There was no pretense in him, no practiced stage persona, just a man sharing his love of music with genuine appreciation for the opportunity. "This next one's for my wife, Maria," he continued, finding her at a table near the front where she sat with Miguel and Consuela. "She believed in me even when I stopped believing in myself." As he began singing Johnny Cash's "I Walk the Line," Joe reflected on how drastically his life had changed in such a short time. He still worked his regular shifts as a janitor. George had been right about not quitting his day job, but evenings and weekends were increasingly filled with small gigs arranged through connections George and Bubba had generously shared. The owner of the Broken Spoke had been hesitant at first, but a personal call from George Strait had convinced him to give Joe a trial run on a Thursday night. That first performance had gone well enough to secure a recurring Saturday spot, which paid modestly but represented something priceless: legitimacy as a performer. Not everyone was thrilled with his sudden rise from obscurity. Some of Joe's co-workers treated his newfound minor celebrity with good-natured ribbing, while others showed thinly veiled resentment. His supervisor, in particular, seemed to take personal offense at Joe's moonlighting, creating increasingly difficult work schedules that made balancing both worlds challenging. As Joe finished his set to enthusiastic applause, he spotted a familiar face at the bar, Victor Reynolds, the music producer Bubba had identified at the charity event. The silver-haired man raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement, his expression inscrutable. Backstage, really just a small storage room that doubled as a green room, Joe carefully packed his guitar. The door opened, and he looked up expecting to see Maria or one of the kids. Instead, Victor Reynolds entered, closing the door behind him. "Mr. Martinez," Victor said, extending his hand. "I've been following your performances around town with interest." Joe shook the offered hand, noting the expensive watch that glinted on Victor's wrist. "Mr. Reynolds, I'm surprised you remember me. I make it my business to remember talent," Victor replied smoothly. "May I?" He gestured to a folding chair. Joe nodded, trying to calm his suddenly racing heart. He knew enough about the music industry to understand that Victor Reynolds wasn't the type who wasted time on hobbyists or weekend warriors. If he was here, he saw something worth pursuing. "I'll be direct," Victor said, crossing one leg over the other. "You have a remarkable voice, authentic, emotive, technically sound despite the lack of formal training. There's a quality to it that can't be manufactured or taught." "Thank you," Joe said cautiously. "I understand George Strait has taken a personal interest in your career." Victor pronounced the last word with slight hesitation, as if unsure whether Joe's musical pursuits qualified for such a term. "He's been incredibly generous with his time and connections," Joe acknowledged. "I owe him everything." Victor nodded thoughtfully. "George is a good man, one of the few genuine articles in this business. But his influence is primarily local these days, focused on Texas and the traditional country scene." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm wondering if you've considered opportunities beyond San Antonio dance halls." Joe's mouth went dry. "What kind of opportunities?" "My company, Horizon Records, specializes in developing artists with crossover potential. In country with contemporary appeal, the kind that gets radio play nationally, not just regionally." Victor's eyes were sharp, assessing. "We have studios in Austin and Nashville, connections with major labels for distribution, and a track record of launching careers." The implications were clear, but Joe needed to hear it plainly. "Are you offering me something, Mr. Reynolds?" "A development deal," Victor confirmed. 6 months of professional studio time, songwriting sessions with established writers, image, consultation, media training, the full package. At the end, if we're both satisfied with the results, a 3-album contract with significant marketing support. Joe sat completely still, afraid that any movement might wake him from what surely must be a dream. This was beyond anything he had allowed himself to imagine, even in the weeks since the charity event had opened new doors. "Why me?" he finally asked. "There are thousands of singers out there with more experience, younger, with established followings." Victor's smile was slight but knowing. "The music industry runs on stories as much as songs, Mr. Martinez, and yours is compelling, the janitor with the hidden gift, discovered by the king of country himself. Audiences love redemption narratives, second chances, everyday people achieving extraordinary things." He spread his hands. "Combine that with your undeniable talent, and we have something marketable." The word marketable struck a discordant note in Joe's mind, but he pushed the thought aside. What would this mean practically? Would I need to move to Austin? Nashville? Eventually, yes, relocation would be necessary. This type of opportunity requires full commitment. Victor studied Joe's expression. "I understand you have family considerations. We can be flexible during the development phase, weekends in Austin perhaps. But if we move forward with an album, that would require a more permanent arrangement. The door opened before Joe could respond, and Maria entered, stopping short when she saw Victor. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were in a meeting." "Not at all," Victor said, rising smoothly. "We were just concluding. Mrs. Martinez, I presume." "Victor Reynolds, Horizon Records." He offered his business card. "Your husband has an extraordinary gift. I hope you'll encourage him to consider my proposal seriously." With that, he nodded to Joe and exited, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. "What proposal?" Maria asked, her eyes wide. "Was that really the Victor Reynolds, the famous producer?" Joe nodded slowly, still processing the conversation. "He offered me a development deal. Professional studio time, songwriting sessions, maybe even an album contract after that." Maria's hands flew to her mouth. "Dios mio, Joe, that's incredible." "It would mean changes," he cautioned. "Eventually moving to Austin or Nashville. It wouldn't be like these local gigs I've been doing." He watched the excitement in Maria's eyes temper with practical concern. The same look she'd worn throughout their marriage whenever opportunities and realities collided. They had built a life in San Antonio, with family, friends, and the stability of known routines. What Victor was suggesting would upend all of it. "We should discuss this at home," Maria said finally, "when the kids aren't waiting and you're not riding the high of a performance." Joe agreed, though his mind raced with possibilities as they collected Miguel and Consuela and drove home in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what Victor's offer might mean for their family. The following morning brought the harsh light of reality as Joe's alarm sounded at 5:30 for his usual shift. Dreams of record deals and studio sessions felt distant as he donned his orange maintenance uniform and packed a simple lunch. This was his real life, the dependable if unglamorous job that had supported his family for years. He arrived at the Municipal Services Building to find his supervisor, Dennis Peterson, waiting with a sour expression. Dennis was a small man with oversized authority who had never shown Joe much warmth even before his musical sideline had emerged. "Martinez," Dennis called, beckoning him into the small office that overlooked the maintenance bay. "Got a complaint about your route yesterday. Business owner says litter wasn't collected on South Alamo Street." Joe frowned. "I definitely cleared that section. Even stayed late to finish it properly." Dennis's expression suggested he didn't believe a word. "Been getting a lot of complaints lately. Seems like your attention might be elsewhere these days." He shuffled some papers on his desk. "What with your singing career and all?" The way Dennis pronounced singing career, with the same dubious inflection Victor Reynolds had used, but lacking the producer's veneer of respect, made it clear what he thought of Joe's musical pursuits. "My work hasn't suffered," Joe insisted, keeping his voice level despite the anger building inside him. "I've never missed a shift, never left a job unfinished." "That's not what these complaints say." Dennis slid a form across the desk. "Written warning. One more incident, and we'll have to consider probation or termination." Joe stared at the paper, recognizing the tactic for what it was, an attempt to force him to choose between his steady job and his reawakened dream. Dennis had always been petty, but this was a new low. "Sign at the bottom," Dennis instructed, clearly enjoying the moment. With stiff fingers, Joe signed the form, his mind racing. He needed this job. The health insurance alone was crucial for his family, not to mention the steady paycheck. But the injustice of the situation burned in his chest. "You know," Dennis said as Joe turned to leave, "not everyone gets to live out their fantasies, Martinez. Some of us have to be realistic about our place in the world." The words hit Joe like a physical blow, echoing thoughts he had wrestled with himself over the years. What right did he have to pursue music at his age, with his responsibilities? Was he being selfish, putting his family's stability at risk for a dream that had already eluded him once? These questions plagued him throughout his shift as he mechanically went through the motions of sweeping streets and emptying public trash cans. By the time he returned home that afternoon, the excitement of Victor Reynolds's offer had been thoroughly tempered by practical concerns. Maria was waiting for him, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a notepad filled with her neat handwriting. The kids were still at school, giving them a rare opportunity to talk privately. "You've been thinking about it," Joe observed, gesturing to her notes. Maria nodded. "I made a list of pros and cons. I thought it might help us see things clearly." Joe smiled despite his troubled mood. This was so characteristic of his practical, organized wife, approaching even a potentially life-altering opportunity with methodical analysis. "Before we get into that," he said, "I should tell you about what happened at work today." He explained the situation with Dennis and the written warning. Maria's expression darkened. "That man has always been jealous of you, Joe. Even before all this, he resented how well-liked you are by everyone else." "Maybe," Joe conceded, "but he's not wrong that I can't keep doing both things forever. Something will have to give eventually." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of decisions hovering between them. "What did your list say?" Joe finally asked. Maria looked down at her notepad. "The practical concerns are obvious: leaving our home, uprooting the kids, the uncertainty of the music business. Miguel is in his senior year next year. Changing. Schools would be difficult. And my job at the clinic, I've finally been promoted to office manager." Joe nodded, his heart sinking. Put that way, Victor's offer seemed like an indulgence they couldn't afford. "But," Maria continued, surprising him, "there are other considerations that don't fit neatly on a pro and con list." "Like what?" "Like the look on your face when you're singing," she said softly. "Like the way our children watched you on that stage with such pride. Like the fact that you've spent 20 years putting everyone else first. And maybe, just maybe, it's time the universe rewarded that." Joe stared at her, speechless. "I didn't marry a janitor, Joe," Maria continued, reaching for his hand. "I married a man with music in his soul. Life pushed that aside, but it never went away. Now there's a chance to reclaim it. How can we not at least consider it?" "It would be a risk," he warned. "Victor made no guarantees beyond the development phase." "Life is a risk," Maria countered. "We've played it safe for so long, maybe too long." She squeezed his hand. "I'm not saying we should jump blindly. We should talk to George, get his opinion on Victor and this offer. Maybe negotiate terms that would protect us if things don't work out. But I don't want fear to make this decision for us." The simple acceptance in Maria's eyes unlocked something in Joe's chest, a hope he had been afraid to fully embrace. If she believed this was possible, maybe it was. "About what Dennis said," Joe began hesitantly, "about knowing my place in the world." Maria's eyes flashed. "Your place is wherever your talent and hard work take you. Dennis Peterson doesn't get to decide that. Neither does Victor Reynolds or even George Strait." Her voice softened. "Only you do, Joe. Only you." As the afternoon light filtered through their kitchen window, Joe thought about the unlikely path that had led him here, from singing alone on empty streets to this crossroads where dreams and reality collided. Whatever choice they made would alter the course of their lives forever. The sound of the front door opening announced Miguel and Consuela's return from school, ending their private conversation, but not the questions that lingered. As his children's voices filled the house with teenage energy and everyday concerns, Joe realized that his decision would affect them all. It wasn't just about music anymore. It was about showing his children that dreams don't have expiration. Dates that second chances can come when least expected, and that sometimes the biggest risk is not taking one at all. The rustic interior of Gordy's BBQ joint buzzed with anticipation. What had begun as a simple lunch meeting had transformed into something far more significant when word spread that George Strait would be there. Now the restaurant was packed, locals pretending they always ate lunch at Gordy's while sneaking glances at the corner booth where George sat with Joe and Bubba. "So he offered you a development deal right off the bat," George said, leaning back as their plates were cleared. "That's unusual, especially for Victor. He typically prefers artists with more established followings." Joe nodded, still uncomfortable discussing business matters with someone of George's stature. Despite the country legend's consistent kindness, Joe couldn't quite shake the feeling that he was out of his depth. "Is that a red flag?" Joe asked. "Maria thought we should get your opinion before making any decisions." George considered this, his weathered features thoughtful. "Not necessarily a red flag. Victor's always had good instincts for commercial potential, and your situation is unique. Good story, authentic talent, plus the novelty factor." "Novelty factor," Joe repeated, not liking the sound of that. "The unexpected discovery angle," Bubba clarified. "Janitor with the hidden gift. It's marketable." There was that word again. Marketable. It made Joe's talent feel like a commodity, something to be packaged and sold, rather than an expression of his soul. George seemed to sense his discomfort. The question isn't whether Victor sees potential in you. He clearly does. The question is what kind of artist he envisions you becoming, and whether that aligns with your own instincts. "I haven't really thought about it that way," Joe admitted. "I've been so focused on whether to take this chance at all, I haven't considered what direction it might take me." "That's exactly where many artists go wrong," George said, his voice taking on the tone of a mentor rather than just a friendly advisor. "They're so grateful for the opportunity that they let the industry reshape them into whatever's trendy. 5 years later, they don't recognize themselves or their music." Bubba nodded agreement. "Dad's seen it happen countless times. Artists who start authentic but end up chasing radio play and streaming numbers until their original spark gets produced and processed out of existence." Joe absorbed this, recognizing the wisdom in their warning. Victor did mention crossover potential and contemporary appeal. "I got the impression he wasn't thinking traditional country." "There it is," George said with a knowing look. "Victor's always chasing the next crossover hit. Nothing wrong with commercial success. Lord knows I've had my share. But you've got to decide what lines you won't cross, what compromises you won't make." A server approached their table, apologetically interrupting to ask George for an autograph for her grandmother. He obliged with gracious charm before returning his attention to Joe. "Here's my advice," George continued. "Talk to Victor again. Be specific about your musical vision. If he's willing to develop you as the artist you want to be, fantastic. If he's looking to remake you into something more marketable but less authentic, walk away." "Is it really that simple?" Joe asked, "walking away from possibly my only shot?" George's eyes, kind but direct, met his. "If this were just about music, maybe not. But you've got a family to consider, roots in this community. Victor's offering you a chance at a dream, but dreams have price tags, Joe. Make sure you're willing to pay what this one will cost." The conversation stayed with Joe long after they parted ways. George had promised to make some calls, check on Victor's reputation with artists he'd worked with recently. The country star's willingness to invest time in Joe's situation was yet another kindness he wasn't sure he deserved. That evening, as Joe prepared for another performance at the Broken Spoke, he found himself at a crossroads both literal and figurative. Standing in the parking lot between his beat-up pickup truck and the venue's back entrance, he called Victor Reynolds. "Joe," Victor answered smoothly, "I was beginning to think you weren't interested in my offer." "I am interested," Joe replied, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. "But I have questions about your vision for my music." "Of course," Victor said, though something in his tone suggested he hadn't expected to be questioned. "What specifically concerns you?" "I'm a traditional country artist at heart," Joe stated plainly. "George Strait, Merle Haggard, Johnny Cash, that's my foundation. I'm not looking to chase trends or cross over to pop markets." A brief silence followed before Victor responded. "Authenticity is certainly part of your appeal, Joe. But the reality of today's music business is that purely traditional country has limited commercial potential. We'd need to incorporate contemporary elements to maximize your chances of success." "How contemporary are we talking?" Joe pressed. Victor's sigh was barely audible. "Production techniques, song selection, image, all would need updating. Nothing drastic, just enough modernization to make you accessible to younger audiences while maintaining your story's appeal." The answer confirmed what George had suggested. Victor saw Joe as raw material to be shaped rather than an artist with his own vision. "I appreciate your honesty," Joe said, "but I need to be just as honest with you. I'm 45 years old, Victor. I don't have time to become someone I'm not. If I'm going to do this, it has to be on terms I can live with." "I understand your concerns," Victor replied, his tone shifting to one Joe recognized from negotiating with his children's teachers, patient but patronizing. "But my expertise in this industry tells me what will work. George Strait could afford to be stubborn about his artistic direction because he broke through in a different era. Today's market is unforgiving to artists who won't evolve." Something in Joe bristled at the dismissal of George's advice and the implication that he was naive to value authenticity. "I'm not saying I won't evolve," he clarified. "I'm saying I won't be packaged into something that doesn't reflect who I am or what I care about." "Perhaps we should table this discussion," Victor suggested, coolness creeping into his voice. "Think about what's at stake, Joe. Opportunities like this don't come along twice, especially for someone in your situation." After ending the call, Joe stood motionless in the parking lot, the weight of decision pressing on him. Victor's offer represented the professional legitimacy he'd dreamed of for decades, but at what appeared to be a considerable cost to his artistic integrity. As he finally entered the venue, still wrestling with these thoughts, he was surprised to find a larger-than-usual crowd for a weeknight. The manager intercepted him before he could reach the small backstage area. "Packed house tonight," the manager informed him with evident pleasure. "Word got around that some Nashville scouts might be dropping by. Your friend George must have made some calls." Joe's heart rate accelerated. More industry people meant more potential opportunities, but also more pressure to impress, to be marketable. As he prepared for his set, adjusting his borrowed microphone and checking his guitar's tuning, Joe found his mind returning to George's warning about artists losing themselves in pursuit of commercial success. From the stage, Joe surveyed the crowd. He spotted Maria and the kids at their usual table, alongside his mother-in-law, who had become a regular supporter since his first performance. In the back, several well-dressed individuals with the unmistakable look of industry professionals sipped drinks and observed with calculated interest. "Evening, folks," Joe greeted the audience, struck by how much more comfortable he felt on stage now compared to that first nerve-wracking charity performance. "For those who don't know me, I'm Joe Martinez. I clean the streets of San Antonio by day and sing by night." Appreciative laughter rippled through the crowd. Joe had learned that acknowledging his unusual path created an immediate connection with audiences. "I had a conversation earlier today that got me thinking about authenticity," he continued, surprising himself with this unplanned opening. "About staying true to who you are, even when opportunities come along that might take you in different directions." As he spoke, Joe noticed a familiar silver-haired figure enter the venue. Victor Reynolds, looking somewhat out of place in his expensive suit among the denim and cowboy hats of the Broken Spoke's regular clientele. "So tonight," Joe said, his resolve strengthening, "I want to share some songs that shaped me, that speak to who I am and where I come from. No frills, no fancy production, just stories set to music, the way country was meant to be." He launched into a set that felt like a declaration of musical identity. George Jones's "He Stopped Loving Her Today", Waylon Jennings's "Good-Hearted Woman", George Strait's "Amarillo by Morning." Each song received enthusiastic response from the crowd, even the industry observers, who had likely come expecting something more contemporary. Halfway through the set, Joe spotted Dennis Peterson, his supervisor, standing awkwardly near the entrance. Their eyes met briefly. Dennis's expression, unreadable before he turned away, disappearing back into the night. The unexpected sighting momentarily threw Joe off rhythm, but he recovered quickly, channeling his confusion into the emotional delivery of Merle Haggard's Working Man Blues. As the set neared its conclusion, Joe made a spontaneous decision. "I'd like to try something different for my final song," he announced. "This is one I wrote myself, just finished it last night. It's called Sweeping Through Life." A murmur of interest rippled through the crowd. Joe had never performed original material before, having always considered himself an interpreter rather than a creator. But the events of recent weeks had stirred something long dormant, and words and melody had flowed together almost without effort. The song began softly, Joe's voice carrying the simple story of a man watching life pass by as he worked, observing the world from the sidelines until an unexpected moment pulled him into the spotlight. There was no self-pity in the lyrics, only reflection and ultimately gratitude for both the struggles and the late-blooming opportunity. As he sang the chorus, "Some dreams get swept away, some get swept back home," Joe saw Maria wiping tears from her eyes. Miguel, usually determined to maintain teenage coolness, was watching with undisguised pride. Consuela recorded the performance on her phone, her face alight with joy. When the final notes faded, the silence lasted only a heartbeat, before applause erupted, genuine, enthusiastic, and prolonged. Joe bowed slightly, overwhelmed by the response to his most personal offering. Backstage, a small crowd awaited him. Not just Maria and the kids, but George and Bubba Strait, along with several people he didn't recognize who were introduced as representatives from independent record labels. "That original song," George said without preamble. "Where have you been hiding that?" Joe shrugged, embarrassed by the attention. "It just came to me. Never thought of myself as a songwriter." "Well, start thinking of yourself that way," George advised. "That's the real deal right there. Your story, your voice, your truth." One of the label representatives, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward. "Lisa Monroe, Longhorn Records," she introduced herself. "We specialize in traditional country and Texas swing. Smaller than Horizon, but we let our artists be themselves." She handed Joe her card. "Call me when you're ready to talk. No rush, no pressure." As the backstage area gradually cleared, Victor Reynolds remained, watching the interactions with calculated interest. When only Joe, Maria, and the Strait family remained, he approached. "Impressive performance," Victor acknowledged, "particularly the original material. Perhaps we were too hasty in our conversation earlier. I may have underestimated your artistic instincts." Joe exchanged a knowing glance with George before responding. "I appreciate that, Victor, but I think we both know we're looking for different things." Victor's smile was thin, but gracious in defeat. "Fair enough. The offer remains open should you reconsider." With a nod to George, he departed, leaving an almost tangible sense of relief in his wake. "You just turned down Victor Reynolds," Maria marveled, her expression a mix of pride and disbelief. "I turned down becoming someone I'm not," Joe corrected gently. "There'll be other opportunities, maybe with Lisa, maybe elsewhere. Whatever happens, we'll face it as a family, on our terms." George clapped him on the shoulder approvingly. "That's what separates artists from entertainers, Joey. Knowing when to say no matters more than knowing when to say yes." As they prepared to leave, Joe was surprised to find Dennis Peterson waiting outside, seemingly uncomfortable, but determined. "Martinez," Dennis began gruffly, "didn't expect to see you performing like that. You're actually good." Coming from Dennis, this reluctant admission was equivalent to effusive praise. Joe nodded cautiously. "Thanks for coming." Dennis shuffled his feet. "About that warning at work, might have been hasty. Could tear it up if you're still planning to keep your day job." The offer represented an unexpected olive branch, one Joe hadn't anticipated. "I appreciate that," he said sincerely. "And yes, I'll be there Monday morning, same as always." As Dennis departed with an awkward nod, George chuckled. "Another convert to the Joey Martinez fan club." "Strangest one yet," Joe agreed with a smile. Later that night, as the Martinez family gathered around their kitchen table with George and Bubba as unlikely guests, the conversation turned to practical matters, how Joe might balance his municipal job with growing musical opportunities, which offers to consider how to navigate this unexpected new chapter without losing sight of what mattered most. "One step at a time," George advised. "Build your audience locally, see where it leads. No need to rush big decisions." As George prepared to leave, he pulled Joe aside. "You know what impressed me most tonight? Not the performance, though that was excellent, but the choice you made with Victor. That took integrity." Joe shook his head modestly. "Just didn't want to go down a path I'd regret." "Exactly," George said. "In this business, knowing who you are and standing firm on that might be the most important skill of all. Some never. Learn it." He extended his hand. "You've got a friend and supporter in me, Joe, whatever comes next." Watching the country legend drive away, Joe stood in his front yard under a vast Texas sky filled with stars. 3 weeks ago, he had been just another invisible worker keeping San Antonio clean, singing to empty streets in the early morning. Hours. Now, improbably, he stood at the threshold of a new life, not one that would replace his old one entirely, but one that would expand it, enrich it, fulfill it. Inside, he could hear Maria laughing with the children, the sound of family that had sustained him through years of deferred dreams. That foundation remained unchanged, a constant in the shifting landscape of his life. Whatever came next, whether modest local success or something greater, he would face it with their love as his anchor and his music as his compass. Joe Martinez, the singing janitor who had captured the attention of the king of country, took one last look at the stars before returning to the warmth of his home, carrying with him the precious understanding that sometimes life's most beautiful melodies are the ones that wait the longest to be heard.